Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for coming out on this sort of frosty June evening. What the heck is going on with that? Two, folks have been signing up for my class this summer. Thank you very much for the people who have. There's a few spots left. There's information on my website if you're interested. It's August 31st, September 1st, and September 2nd. All the information's on the website. If you're interested, a few slots left. And again, thanks to everybody. People coming from Germany, people coming locally, people coming from Dubai, I think. So should be an interesting mix of folks there. Tonight, against my better judgment maybe, but oh no, here we go. Let's just do it. So this is the ethics of moral ambiguity. Now, it's important to remember that Socrates was put to death by the fine citizens of Athens. He was put to death by the fine citizens of Athens, not for any particular thing that he believed or any particular thing that he argued, but more or less because he kept arguing against what everybody else believed. He was a big proponent of moral and intellectual ambiguity. So it turns out that if you want to irritate people, give this lecture. So let me apologize up front. It is not my intention to irritate. It is my intention to sort of hopefully alleviate some stress and anxiety that we might be feeling about the modern world, which I think is in part, but not entirely, derived from an excessive interest in clarity and being sure all the time. So just start with some quotes here. These are from Plato. Although I do not suppose that either of us know anything really beautiful and good, I am better off than he is, for he knows nothing and thinks that he knows. I neither know nor think that I know. And this is from the Apology, of course, by Plato, and that's Socrates speaking. And this is sometimes translated as and summarized as, I know that I know nothing. This is not actually correct. It's closer to say Socrates knew what he did not know, right? So he wasn't ever really claiming to be totally ignorant, which would be silly and not in keeping with all, much of what he talked about. It was more that he was pretty clear that he didn't know very much, and he was really clear on the things about which he was confused and filled with doubt. And the other thing, when he says no, he means really, absolutely, total certainty, no. And what he meant was, I don't have a lot of things in that category. There's a lot of stuff that I just really don't know. The longer version of this, just in case you'd think this might be a one-off passage, comes from the Meno, and it's a hilarious passage. I've abbreviated a little bit. And Meno says, "Can you tell me, Socrates, whether virtue is acquired by teaching or by practice? Or if neither by teaching nor practice, then whether it comes to man by nature or in what other way?" And Socrates answers, "My dear Meno, here at Athens there is a dearth of the commodity, and all wisdom seems to have immigrated from us to you. I am certain that if you were to ask any Athenian whether virtue was natural or acquired, he would laugh in your face and say, 'Stranger, you have far too good an opinion of me, if you think that I can answer your question. For I literally do not know what virtue is, much less whether it is acquired by teaching or not. And I myself, Meno, living as I do in this region of poverty, am as poor as the rest of the world. And I confess with shame that I know literally nothing about virtue. When I do not know the quid of anything, how can I know the quail? How, if I knew nothing at all of Meno, could I tell if he was fair or the opposite of fair, rich and noble, or the reverse of rich and noble? Do you think that I could?" Meno answers, no, indeed. But are you in earnest, Socrates, in saying that you do not know what virtue is? And am I to carry back this report of you to Thessaly?" Socrates, "Not only that, my dear boy, but you may say further that I have never known of anyone else who did, in my judgment." Again, this is from the Meno, and it's translated by Jowett. Probably the preferred translation for readability. It's a bit archaic, but by Jowett, yes.
Who was Meno?
Meno was a visiting thinker, sort of bon vivant, I guess, man about town from Thessaly. And at this point, Thessaly had a reputation for having very excellent thinkers. And so he was traveling from Thessaly to visit Athens and to say, hey, we've got, I think Gorgias was there in Thessaly at the time, we've got these smart people, what's going on in Athens? We've heard of Socrates, we've heard he's a smart guy, and he's like, well, I think you've heard wrong. If you're going to ask me about what I know about virtue, I think you've heard wrong. And I read these two quotes because I think one of our knee-jerk reactions these days is to know what the moral value of everything is instantly. Whatever happens, we know if it's good or if it's bad. We know without much reflection, and we feel like we're supposed to know. We're supposed to go, oh, this happened, I know that's a bad thing. Or that's a good thing. Usually it's a bad thing. We're really good with the bad stuff. Right? Oh, that's a terrible thing. That's a horrible thing. And it's almost this instantaneous response to world events, local events, whatever is going on. We want to immediately do first, is it good or bad, right? Put a moral stamp on it. And then we usually say, oh, it's bad or it's good. We got just real quick. And then the problem with this is once you've ascribed a moral value to it, good or bad, notice this is like it's like an on-off switch. Something that is wrong is just wrong. There's no extension to it. So it can be a little wrong or a lot wrong, but it's all just wrong. So everything that happens comes to us with the same magnitude of badness because it falls in the criteria of wrong, or goodness because it falls in the criteria of right. And so it does two things to our thinking. One, it stops thinking, because thinking starts when you say, I wonder what that means. I wonder why that is. I wonder what's going on here. But if you stop and say, oh, that's bad, well, then you just stop wondering, right? You need to wonder anymore because you just know it's bad. And now the notion is, oh, how do I respond to bad things? Well, I condemn them. Great, good, I'm done. So we're not thinking. We go, oh, that's bad, that's good. I've identified them as bad and good. I'm done. Yay. Right? And so there's many examples. One of my favorite, because this has come up weirdly, as people have explained to me that slavery is bad. And I'm like, okay. And they're like, yeah, there used to be slaves in the past. I'm like, okay. One, it's weird to say that history was bad. Right? Condemning history is a very strange thing because history does not care. Right? History is the record of stuff that's happened. Now, we might look back and say, wow, wouldn't the world be a better place if this didn't happen? Certainly. But getting morally outraged or having all this clarity about history is weird. It's weird. If anything is not clear, it's history. It's such a confusing mishmash of competing threads and documents. But trying to read history as a moral tale. By the way, there's a very ancient tradition of doing this. This is medieval scholasticism, ancient Egypt, all their texts are this way. Many ancient Chinese texts are written this way. They're written to say that history is a moral tale, and we're at some place in that moral. Greek history, by the way, up until you get Herodotus and Thucydides, were written the same way. That, if you're an emperor or a pharaoh of Egypt, say, you are living in the golden era. You are the embodiment of the golden age. Time stops with you. Everything glows around you. That was their view of history. The pharaoh is the incarnation of perfection, so it stopped with each pharaoh. So it had a weird history. Many of the pharaohs would just carve their names over other pharaohs' names for like victories and battles and treaties and stuff. So because good things associated with the pharaoh. So it didn't matter when they happened. I'm the pharaoh, good stuff, yay. The Greeks thought everything was declining. Golden age, silver age, bronze age, and then crap. Right? They thought they were on this decline, and so they read history as this moral tale of decline. And it was Herodotus and Thucydides, two of the early thinkers in the Greek world, who were like, that may not be a great way to understand history. And I think they were right. They were right 2,400 years ago, and I think they're still right today. It's not a good way to understand history is trying to read it as a moral tale, because it's really not a moral tale. I mean, bad things happen. We go, that was terrible. Good things happen. Oh, that was good. But mostly it's not about bad and good. It's about a lot of other things that you can only have if your mind is open to them. But again, when we're constantly inundated with information, how do we sort it? Well, one of the quickest ways is to continually say, Good, bad, good, bad, good, bad, good, bad. I know I'm against the bad stuff and I know I'm for the good stuff. Hey, presto, I've solved everything. If you stop on any issue, doesn't matter what the issue is, and go, hold on a second now. What does this mean? What you find out is, you can only think about like one thing, maybe a week, maybe a day if it's really not a very complex thing. And then you go, wait a second, maybe I need to do some more research, do some reflection. Maybe I need to talk to some people and find out more. Is this really what, and also, what's my time frame, again, speaking historically? Something that might be terrible today, if you look at it in the arc of 100 years, may not be a big deal. If you look at it in the arc of the universe, it doesn't matter at all. Right? I can't remember, there was a British prime minister who had on his desk, the quote is something like, "We are on a tiny rock floating in cold space. Soon we will die and be no more," right? Like just this, like completely, like, so don't, and it was a message to himself to say, hey, don't get too worried, don't get too wrapped up in all of this, right? It's transitory. In the great arc of history, how important is any of it, right? Maybe a little important to us, may influence us, but should we get that upset about things? Should we get that overwhelmed by them? Particularly when, again, we're presented with this endless drumbeat of what's generally presented as catastrophes. One catastrophe after another catastrophe after another catastrophe. And I'll give you an example of what this does, and I know this will be a controversial example, of course, this is the nature of this talk, but I was fascinated by the governments, and I mean governments all over the world, response to the pandemic. Because by definition, nobody knew what to do. This is the thing with a new pandemic. You don't know what to do. That's what it is. If they knew what to do, you wouldn't have a pandemic, right? And almost every government, there are very few exceptions that I could find, certainly not ours was no exception, felt like they needed to say with very great clarity and certainty what we're going to do and why. Even though the science was like, whoa, like literally when you have something new, the science says, yeah, we don't know. We're running a big experiment. In like 8 years, we're going to know exactly what we should have done. Right? But politicians, as far as I can tell, didn't come out and go like, you know what? We have no real idea. We're going to try to mitigate what might be potentially some bad outcomes. We'll sort of shoot and hope for some of the good. But really, it's a mess. Stay tuned for future updates because it could change at any moment. See, that's very uninspiring. Right? And notice the sureness came from everybody. If you're like, vaccines are good, you're like, oh, get vaccinated, you'll never get COVID, everything will be great, the world will go back to normal. Yeah, the vaccine scientists were like, hey, wait, hold on, wait, time out, like we're going to have variants and different uptakes, and what are you saying? And then the other people like, if you take the vaccine, you'll die, you'll become a Chinese communist spy, something terrible will happen to you. But they said it with absolute certainty, right? Everybody was giving you messages of absolute certainty, except for I think mostly the researchers who were like, meh, it'd be great is if we had a couple of parallel worlds that we could give COVID to some of them and not give COVID, right? That would be cool. And then we could run this multi-part experiment and get back to you, but we don't have that world. And so my favorite one is the early on, which is totally reasonable, by the way. They're like, wash your hands. Everybody wash your hands, right? Remember this? Wash your hands. Surfaces, wash your hands. Totally reasonable. This is not in any way an unreasonable response. And then they found out that, not so much. But that was too late, right? Already they didn't really come out and say, hey, we were wrong about that. They sort of worked in this fine print. Like, hey, don't worry about that. It's not that big of a deal, really, probably not going to have any impact. Because they didn't want to go, oh, we were wrong. This is one of the problems with being really sure about things, is then the stakes of being wrong go way up. If you start out going, you know what? Probably a good idea to wash your hands. Probably a good idea to wash your hands anyway. Let's get serious about it. And they go later on, they go, you know what? Keep washing your hands just because that's good generally, but not going to do anything for COVID. See, the stakes are so much lower, it gives you room to maneuver. It also keeps you from lying. Because this is what the problem all kinds of people got in trouble with, is because it turns out that they're at some point, artificial certainty becomes essentially a lie. right? And they have to go like, oh, how do you back up from that? Very difficult, right? And so we've been inundated, not just the pandemic, with everything, all kinds of stories where we're supposed to know instantly how we're supposed to feel about it. And in fact, that might be fine, but at some point you've probably been aware that sometimes, occasionally, our feelings mislead us. You ever had this experience? Every once in a while, a friend of mine, she refers to her first boyfriend as learning experience, and I think that's a great, right? Like, he was an educational opportunity, right? Like, so feelings potentially not entirely reliable. So it's okay to know how we feel about stuff. That's great. Totally embrace that. Know how you feel. That's very important. But maybe not believe exactly how you feel about everything. And then to be able to take a moment and go, can we take a pause? Can we step back and look at the details? And we just get obsessed with these sorts of things. And again, the artificial certainty closes off your capacity to think. That's the problem, number one. And number two, it kills discernment. Because you go, okay, where in the level of importance should I rate the Ukraine war versus the Supreme Court stuff versus the economy versus inflation, right? No, everything is a catastrophe. Each one of these destroys Tokyo, right? We know these are all monsters destroying Tokyo. Everyone is equally bad, when really, probably not. This is probably not all equally bad, at least even to you, right? One, you want to be the person who's deciding how you feel about it. You don't want somebody else to tell you, feel bad about this, and you go, yes. Feel good about this, you go, yes. Right? Because then you're not thinking at all, you're just responding. And of course, this will lead you to being overwhelmed. At the end of the Meno, there's a third character in here that Plato and Meno are talking to. There's no good way to edit this in. But Plato says, and go back and tell your friend, Antipathus, I think his name was, to not worry so much. I think he'll feel better and he'll be less aggravated with his fellow men if he just steps back a little bit and recognizes that, hey, maybe it's not as clear as we think. Maybe everything isn't black and white. And that capacity to suspend judgment, at least for a little while. And go, oh, what does this look like in a year? What does this look like in 10 years? What does this look like in 30 years? You get reports all the time. I love this where they'll say, oh, this is the worst, inflation we've had since 2019. And you go, well, that was 3 years ago. This is the first market, this is the word, like financial news in particular often has these dates attached to it. And it's like, oh, that was like so this is the worst in 4 years? That doesn't seem that bad, right? And they'll just back it up until they find a year. Now, if they say the worst in the last 100 years, you go, oh, shit's bad, right? That seems bad, like worst in 100 years, not so good. If they say worst in, 5 years, it's like, how bad? I'm not that bad. Right? Another one, just picking news stories at random, like, housing market looked like house prices might collapse. And it's like, some people are like, hey, that would be awesome. Right? Like, that would be so great. Like, please collapse. Right? Other people are going, no, well, hey, I just bought a house at the top of the market, might lose it, so that's terrible, right? Notice what a mixed bag this is. In theory, it's bad, but in practice, for a lot of people, if we could cut the housing price by like 40%, they would be pretty stoked. Right? A lot more people might be able to afford to buy a house if the prices fell from, by the way, historic highs. Right? But the news will not report this as like purchasing opportunity. It will be like, a catastrophic fall in house values, which will also be if you're on the other side of that equation. Right? But this is not clear in any way. In fact, almost nothing economic is clear. It's always like bleh. Hyperinflation, clearly really bad. Some inflation, bad, but mixed. again, depending on where you stand, what you are, what you're doing. And so we get overwhelmed. I think this is the big problem. It shuts off thinking. It makes everything seem the same scale. And so people will say, oh, every day is just one horrible story after another horrible story. And it's like, yes, this is what the news specializes in. But are they horrible stories of the same scale? Right? Once you've just got the light switch good, bad, then yes, it's all the same scale because it's bad, 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 bad. It's the 7 deadly sins. They're not ranked in order of badness. They're just all deadly. Right? It's not like the moderately unhealthy sin. Yeah, actually, that's probably okay. Once in a while sin. This one really avoid sin. No, 7 deadly. Doesn't matter which one you do, equally deadly. By the way, this is no surprise that our culture does this because this is, of course, very tied into our theological roots that rate this way. Making a mistake or being morally wrong wasn't a matter of, oh, I kind of messed up, or oh, that's not very good. It's like, no, you're going to hell. It's damnation. Right? So that's a big downside risk. Right? Like so it's like, ooh, so you avoid all of them because you don't know which one is the one that sends you to hell. And so that's that moral reflex, is to place everything within that context, rather than going, messy, philosophical history, lots of dynamic social change. It's a mess out there. By the way, always been a mess out there. We do not live in a failed utopia. Like 4 years ago, the world was not perfect, and then suddenly something went tragically wrong. 4 years ago, the world was sort of a mess, and 4 years later, the world is sort of a mess. Right? And 4 years from now, the world's probably going to be sort of a mess, because that's how if history is any guide, it's going to be flavor of mess. By the way, this doesn't mean that no progress has been made. I know this is controversial. I'm not saying I don't believe in teleology. I don't think we're going anywhere. But certainly you can look at history and say, shit's a lot better now than it has ever been. And people keep telling me how horrible the news is. And I'm not that old, getting older, but not that old. But I remember when I was growing up, all of Central and South America, most of the Middle East, and much of Africa were at war continuously. For a decade. And there's nothing like that today. The Ukraine war, bad, right? Okay, fine. That's not a good thing. But like comparatively speaking, wow. If you talk to somebody in the late 60s or early 70s and said, wow, we've got like 3 major global conflicts going on, they're like, you live in utopia, right? That's an unbelievable achievement. Until the late 1950s, millions, if not tens of millions of people starved to death pretty regularly. In 1900, I've said this before in other lectures, 80% of the world's population was subject to endemic starvation and hunger. 80%, like 120 years ago. Today, almost all is due to political unrest and conflict. It's not due to simply just lack of food. And statistically, on every measure, it's dramatically less, like unbelievable, miraculously less. But we don't hear about that. We don't talk about that. We don't think about that because we know we live in the worst time ever because every day is a sequence of unbroken catastrophes. And so, another quote here, this is from Walter Kaufmann. How does one respond to this? Now, he has the best idea, I think, or at least a very good idea on this. He says, the first virtue lacks any single name, but is a fusion of humility and aspiration. Humility consists in realizing one's stark limitations and remembering that one may be wrong. But humility fused with smugness, with complacency, with resignation is no virtue to my mind. What I praise is not meekness that squats in the dust, content to be lowly, eager not to stand out, but humility winged with ambition. There is no teacher of humility like ambition. Petty aspirations can be satisfied and may be hostile to humility. Hence, ambition and humility are not two virtues. Taken separately, they are not admirable. Fused, they represent the first cardinal virtue. Since there is no name for it, we shall have to coin one at the risk of sounding humorous. Humbition. Meekness says, judge not, that you not be judged. Ambition replies, judge, that you may be judged. And I love that. By the way, Walter Kaufmann was a native German, and in German you just stick words together. So this is a very German thing to do. Grab a couple of words, stick them together, make a new word. In English, ambition, it's rough, right? It really is like, it doesn't, I don't know, nice try. But notice the idea here. The idea is to recognize and feel and know, I could be wrong. I might be mistaken. But I'm still going to try. I'm still going to think. I'm still going to do anyway. So humility, don't know, could be wrong. We'll have to see. Ambition, but I'm going to think, I'm going to judge, I'm going to do, I'm going to act. He thought this was the way you address this. Because often if people say, don't judge or don't know, it is this sort of mock humility. It's like, I don't know. I'm just going to resign. I'm just going to shrug my shoulders. There's there's nothing I can do about it. I'm just weak and worthless of whatever. Just ignore everything. And it's not worth bothering with. Right? This sort of quietist resignation, as he mentions here. He's like, he has no part of that. He's not interested in that at all. In fact, there's another way he articulates this is he says, strong convictions, loosely held. That's his idea. Strong convictions, but you don't want to hold them too tight because you might find out like, whoa, hey, maybe I've got this the wrong way around. Or maybe, now I've got some new information that makes me go, that changes my perspective quite a bit. This is quite a different sort of feeling. So that notion of allowing yourself to allow yourself, it's okay to be wrong. See, moral judgment doesn't allow that. To be wrong about morals is to sin. To sin is to go to hell. But if you give yourself a moment to pause and allow yourself to be incorrect, allow yourself to misjudge, to give yourself that opportunity. And I think a lot of this problem that we struggle with, again, is because we get so much thrown at us, and we feel like we're obligated to have a response. Very rarely do we get to say, I'll get back to you that in a couple of years. I'm going to really need to think about that. I love it when people say this. It's very rare, but anytime somebody says that to me, I'm like, this is a very good person. Because it takes such courage to go, I'm going to need to reflect on that before I have anything I think might be worth saying. Think about how often you hear this. It's really, really rare. And I think hugely valuable. But notice our training is almost exclusively fast response, right? Everything is like, they're a fast thinker. They're a quick thinker. They're really bright. They were able to finish that test in 10 minutes. They were able to get through the 600 SAT tests in 2 hours or whatever. Like, this is valuable somehow. Like, this is a useful skill. It's really not that much of a useful skill. A really good skill is to be able to take as much time as you have to think as deeply as you can about what matters to you. That's a useful skill. Right? How many of you have done this? Probably you need to have an answer. You need to think. We do have to make decisions. We are mortal. We have timelines. And you go, next Wednesday I'm going to have to choose something or make up my mind. And we try to answer it then. Right? You've got a week. And people, I've had this conversation many times with people because I kind of remind myself. I'm terrible at this, by the way. I'm not throwing rocks. I'm terrible at this. Try to remind myself, take as much time as you have. And so people say, we're trying to decide, it just could be trivial. So where we're going on vacation. It's like, we got to buy the tickets next week. And I said, we're thinking about this, this, and this. And you're like, well, why? Just relax. Just take a week. Right? Just don't worry about it. Just give yourself as much time as you have and see what comes to the fore. And if you have a good idea now, take a little time. Maybe you'll come up with a better idea. But if it's if we frame things morally, then it's like another example again from contemporary school shootings. It's like you're not supposed to stop and think whether you think school shootings are good or bad, right? We're not, that you're like, no, you need to know right now whether this is a good thing or a bad thing. And so we go, oh, it's a bad thing. Done. It's a crazy response. Like, oh, I'm done thinking about it because it's bad, and I know it's bad. Like, it turns out there's not a big pro-school shooting movement, as far as I know, right? Everybody agrees this is not good, I guess, or almost everybody. So we go, okay, we agree on that, but we're not done. Like going, this is a terrible thing. It turns out that people I probably know this, we're the only country in the world that does this. There's been more school shootings in the United States than the rest of the world combined by like times 20, which is weird. And so the beginning of thinking about it is not going, oh, this is morally repugnant and hateful. It's to go, what's up? And lots of countries that have a lot of guns don't have school shootings. You know? So, I mean, guns, sure. I mean, that's probably a problem. But it can't be the whole problem. Because there's a lot of countries out there with lots of people with lots of guns, and they just don't do school. Like, most countries don't do this. It's like not a thing. It's like we could levitate or something. Like, wow, that's weird. Americans can levitate. Right? But somehow it's like, oh, we just immediately go, this is bad. Oh, it's the guns, or it's the video games, or it's like we want to, it's a morally repugnant and hateful thing, therefore answer, bang. Clearly, this is a systemic problem of our society that's going to be complex and difficult to unwind and to figure out. And we're going to have to stop and ponder it. But our response is just to say, oh, this is horrible, which, sure, but that's not very helpful. Identifying things as horrible and morally wrong is just like, okay, great, now what? That's not done. And again, if we really do that, then we close our minds. And we go, oh, like, now we can't think about it anymore. In fact, it almost feels wrong to think about it because it suggests you don't know that it's morally repugnant. You don't need to think about morally repugnant things, you need to condemn them. Done. I've done my job. I don't need to worry about this anymore. I can move along to the next horrible catastrophe. And I can say, that's a terrible thing too. Repeat ad infinitum. It's totally incoherent, by the way. This doesn't allow you to form any view of the world, except for that the world is morally repugnant. And then people feel overwhelmed and that the world is a horrible place. Because if you approach it that way, the world is a horrible place, because you've just decided this. By the way, this is simply, good old-fashioned medieval Old Testament theology, where you were living in a terrible fallen world, we're all sinners, everything is crap, and the sooner we get out of here, the better. Right? I mean, it's a very well-established thought pattern with thousands of pages of medieval theology behind it. If anybody can bear to read it, good for you. It's really tough going. But that's the idea. We've been here before. We've thought this pattern before. Cotton Mather is the guy. If anybody wants to read an actual source for this in America, read Cotton Mather's. There's a bunch of Mathers. Cotton is one of the most famous ones, but just read practically any work by him at random and you'll be like, holy shit, he writes the newspapers. Right? It hasn't changed. The narrative has not changed. I did an article some time ago where I compared Cotton Mather's speech on witchcraft, and I just pulled out witches and put in terrorists, and you can read it and you can print it, no problem. It's just pure, right there. It's a fallen world. We're sinners. We're being punished. It's a series of catastrophes. It's morally corrupt and bankrupt. The best we can do is shield ourselves away and hope for better days. Right? We're overwhelmed. It's awful. It's morally repugnant. Socrates, on the other hand, suggests, as does Kaufman and Epicurus and many other thinkers throughout history, that, maybe not, Simone de Beauvoir. Maybe we could begin rethinking this approach. Maybe we would just be much happier if we were like, I don't know. Let me think about that. Give me a moment to ponder. again, one of the classic philosophy examples they always give, which tend to drive me mad, is like, okay, you're looking at a train track, and there's a drunk laying on the track, and if you flip the switch, you can get the train to save his life, but the train is filled with kids going to a museum, and then they'll be all beat up, and maybe some of them will die if you switch it off the track. So are you going to let the guy die and save the children, or are you going to damage the children and save the guy? And I'm always like, what? Like, that's the world we live in? These are my moral choices? Like, this is my ethical problem, whether or not to kill children or to kill an old drunk guy? What kind of, I rarely run into this. Maybe some of the older people have run into this, but I really don't, it doesn't seem to occur. But this is the idea. Oh, everything is this horrible, vexed moral choice where your decision between right and wrong must be defended against, the sort of ethical principles of philosophical history, so you're going to lose on that one every time. As opposed to going, as Socrates suggests, what's a joy is to think about these things. What's helpful is to stop and take a moment and really, really ask ourselves and ask other people, what do they mean? Why? What impact does this have? What impact does it have over the short term? What is the impact over the long term? What values do I have that I hold dear that this maybe helps fulfill versus the ones that maybe it helps, but that it violates, and so therefore this makes me unhappy with why it violates them? How is this an expression of the world? Is this sort of random-ish, or is this sort of more systematic? What part, if any, do I have in this? Am I contributing to this? Right? Or is it just happening out there and poof? Like, this is why people get so upset about history, and I'm like, yes, on one hand I understand history is like, wow, but on the other hand it's like, you can't, like, what? What are you going to do? Go back and keep the Egyptians from enslaving people? I don't know. Maybe. Then you don't get pyramids. Pyramids are kind of cool, but probably better if I had my choice. I wouldn't have had them build the pyramids. They could have done nice gardens. Would have been more fun to build, I imagine, for everybody involved. But pyramids look heavy. Those rocks look heavy. But those aren't up to us. It's not us. And so if you go with the moral vision on, which again, very medieval, you almost can't see history. It almost escapes you. The choices that people have had to make, the kinds of influences that are going on, where our ideas come from. And finally, as you're thinking about this, and to go back to the ambition thing, again, is not about letting go of your capacity to think or reason. It's about embracing it. About giving yourself time to think about, reflect on, and care about those things that you actually care about. Because the other thing that happens is when you're getting this constant drumbeat of input, you actually don't care about almost any of it. But you convince yourself that you do, but it's not possible to care about everything. Again, this is why you have to have the moral switch. Because, how much can you actually think and reflect on? How much do you really care about? What are your core values? Turns out, probably doesn't cover 3/4 of what's thrown at us in any given day, week, month of news and culture and whatever is going on. And that sort of diffusion of our own capacities disables our ability to think and reason, because we don't have the time and we don't have the depth of reflection necessary to allow us to reach meaningful conclusions on our own. And so we end up with this very surface detached sense of dis-ease, which people talk about all the time. It's like, yes, of course, because none of that is actually really penetrating to where you can go, oh yes, this is vitally important to me. This I really care about. This is of complete and utter significance to me. And so I want to reflect and think about it. And that other stuff, I'm just going to have to let go of that. One way I like to imagine it is, because I'm a hopeless fan of the NFL, if you watch other sports, it's always weird to see a sport you don't care about. Because what you realize is the trope is exactly the same. right? But you don't know any of the people and you don't care about the sport. So you're like, well, this is some silly cult, right? The NFL, now that's important, right? You know, this is this weird distinction. And it's very easy and trivial with sports. When I was in France, we watched some of a EuroLeague soccer match. It was a big championship match, and I turned it off at halftime because I was like, I was tired, and I'm like, I don't really care. But they were really excited. I mean, the whole place was in Paris. When we were in Paris, they're like, whoa, people are super stoked about this match. And I'm like, oh, that's interesting, because I don't really care. I didn't know any of the players, didn't know any of the team, didn't even know what was happening, right? And you go, oh, right. Yeah, and I think that's a good metaphor for most of the things going on in the world. It's okay for people to love their thing. Love your thing. Believe in your thing. Value what you value. Care about what you care about. But then, don't really pay attention or care about the rest. Know why you're focusing on what you're focusing. Who's deciding what you're focusing on? Socrates was a big one on this. Kept asking people, well, why did you think this? Where did this idea come from? Where did it land on you? Right? Who put this in your mind? And finally, just to end with Socrates, and hopefully not to be have to drink hemlock, he asks this question here that is not answered. He says, where does, Meno asks him, where does virtue come from? And I love Socrates' answer because this is consistent from the Phaedrus, from the Symposium, from the Meno. I think it's in two other ones, but at least those three, and I think it's in a couple of other ones, where he says, where does this come from? He says it comes from actually the gods. That any real discernment, any true judgment is a type of madness. That actually you can't really totally reason your way to these things. That you need reason, you need wisdom, you need insight, but you also need inspiration. And where does inspiration come from? He says it's a type of madness. It's a type of sudden awareness, an insight that must come, he says, from the gods. And finally, I think this is perhaps the greatest and most irritating part about this desire to continually know the truth, the black or whiteness of everything, is that I think it completely shuts down inspiration. It really closes our minds to what Socrates said would come from the gods, which is that moment of insight, inspiration that comes from that strong, powerful feeling within where you go, oh, I see this differently. I see this new. I see this with new eyes. The world is made over when you get one of those deep insights, when you get one of those inspirations. But if the world is simply switched black and white all the time, you have no space for or need for this. It's not like you're going to say, oh, I just had this inspiration that school shootings are spectacular. Right? Nope, they're bad, move on. This is bad, move on. This is bad. And so it makes the world very shallow, really unnerving, and not needed for reflection. And if you're nervous, unsettled, and you don't have reflection, inspiration, that great triumph of knowing that comes from deep within, that Socrates and Plato both said was divine, is sort of precluded from our experience. So, humbition, I think, terrible word, but great concept. And strong convictions, loosely held. This is very, very much better and very much healthier than our rush to moral indignation and instantaneous judgment. So, thank you very much.